Good morning, econ students. I'm here to talk to you today. So we finished trade. Keep working on those worksheets if you haven't done so already. With comparative advantage, it's just a little bit from Unit 1 that we pushed to later in the year with comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Keep asking questions. You guys have been asking great questions. Keep asking questions if you're struggling with that. Today we're going to shift gears, and I do have some good news for you when it comes to the advanced placement exam in May 21st. You will not be asked to draw any graphs on the AP test. That said, you still need to know all the graphs. Okay, so like for instance, they may ask you questions about the money market. Now you won't be asked to draw the money market and then transfer that via whatever you're using, the College Board website when you're taking the test. Transfer it to the College Board, but they may ask you questions like, the Fed buys bonds. What effect does that have on interest rates? And being able to draw those graphs and knowing what they look like can play a big role in you getting the question right. So I'm gonna keep teaching you about graphs. There's still a couple more that we need to know, and that's the theme of today. Today is the loanable funds market. Now, last unit, you learned about the money market. Okay, there's our money market with, as you can see, demand for money, inversely related to interest rates. That's asset demand and transaction demand. And the money supply. And the main thing we focused on was the money supply. Remember, the money supply is moved around by the Fed. Okay, so when the Fed uses easy money policy, it increases the money supply, so shifts it to the right. When the Fed uses contractionary monetary policy, to fight inflation, it shifts money supply to the left, and interest rates go up, and interest rates go up, investment goes down, and investment goes down, aggregate demand goes down, and that whole chain reaction. So hopefully you remember at least a little bit of that from the money market. Now today's graph is similar in that we're talking about the impact of actions by either the Fed or by government or individuals on the interest rates. So what we have is it's called the loanable funds market. Now, basic idea of the loanable funds market, we're talking about people borrowing money, okay, or people putting money in banks. It's a little more decentralized than the money market. Typically, one way to know that you're dealing with a money market question versus loanable funds market question is, if the Fed's involved. Typically, if the Fed's involved, you draw a money market graph. If we're talking about government, and you could draw a money market if government spending goes up because demand for money would go up. But for the most part, we're talking about, commercial banks in this case, rather than the national bank, the Federal Reserve. So let me show you what the loanable funds market looks like. We'll start with the easy part. Okay, so quantity of loanable funds is your x-axis, and your y-axis is interest rates. In this case, it's real. Remember, in the money market, you're dealing with nominal interest rates. In the loanable funds market, you're dealing with real interest rates. Okay. Demand curves all pretty much look the same. They slope down to the right, showing an inverse relationship. And this basically means that at high interest rates, you're not going to borrow a lot of money. Okay, whether you're the government or businesses or consumers. At high interest rates, you're not going to borrow a lot of money because that would cost you a lot. I have a loan of $300,000 for a house and interest rates are 10%. Wow, that's going to accumulate fast. So you borrow less when interest rates are high. Okay, quantity of loanable funds is low when you're up here. If interest rates are really low, as they are right now, maybe you're willing to borrow more. And this is kind of one of the goals of keeping interest rates low right now nationally, is to get people to borrow money to start businesses and buy homes and things like that to try to keep the economy afloat during the pandemic. Okay, so when we're talking about the components of demand for loanable funds, it's our old friends from GDP. The main groups are consumers, businesses, and the government. It's demand for loanable funds. These are your main borrowers. Hey, consumers borrow to build homes and buy cars and finance college education. Businesses borrow to start to build factories and start their businesses. Government borrows to, well, pay for pretty much everything. $2 trillion stimulus plans and things like that. So those are all your demand for loanable funds. Okay, hopefully you're with me so far. If any time, and we'll do some examples, this is the end. If any of them borrow more money, so if any of these groups borrow more money or want to borrow more money or spend more money, demand for loanable funds will go up. If they decide to spend less or borrow less, demand for loanable funds will go down. Supply of loanable funds slopes up to the right. So you're basically looking at one of the same types of graphs we've been dealing with all year. Okay, supply is an inverse or a direct relationship between interest rates and how much is supplied. And we'll make sure we label our equilibrium here. Okay, so the loanable funds market helps determine the equilibrium real interest rate. Now, supply of loanable funds, you could throw the Fed in there because the Fed is honestly, if the Fed, well, we'll get to some Fed examples in a second. But the main people who supply loanable funds are savers. That's you guys. And international consumers, foreigners, because this is one of those things that probably going to play less a role on the AP tests because we're not going to talk about international trade all that much. Is that foreigners putting money in our economy? Like if China decides, hey, it would be a good idea to put all our money in American banks. Now American banks have more money to lend out. Same thing with savers. Hey, we look at you guys. You would save more money if interest rates are really high. Right now, interest rates are really low. Hey, you put your money in a bank and you get 0.0001% interest. Well, you're not that motivated to put money in the bank in a savings account the banks can then loan out. Okay. When it's high, well, people are going to, hey, we can put more money in the bank. It's a good investment to put money in the bank. Hey, if it's like a 6% interest rate on a certificate of deposit or something like that. So, supply of loanable funds will be high. So, if people are putting more money in banks, then banks have more money to lend out. Okay, hence supply of loanable funds. Okay, so hopefully you're with me so far. So that's what your loanable funds market looks like. Now let's do a couple examples. Let's say, for instance, right now, the government is borrowing copious amounts of money to try to help keep the economy afloat. That would increase your demand for loanable funds. So because G is going up, your government borrowing is going up, demand for loanable funds goes up. If demand for loanable funds goes up, what happens to interest rates? That's right, interest rates increase as well. Hopefully you remember this term because I guarantee it'll show up somewhere on the AP test, even in FRQ form. Or if government spending goes up and this causes interest rates to go up and interest rates going up cause investment to go down, that's the crowding out effect. So that'd be one example. Okay, give me another one. Let's say, give me a second to draw a new graph here. So there's our reset graph. Let's say, for instance, the government decided to lower tax rates on savings, meaning you wouldn't have to pay interest or you wouldn't have to pay taxes on the interest you make on a savings account. Well, doing so, people would say, hey, we should put our money in savings accounts. This would increase the supply of loanable funds. Okay. So if we increase the supply of loanable funds because people want to put more money in the bank, people want to save more, this would decrease interest rates and the whole chain reaction. Decrease interest rates would increase investment and so on and so forth. I mentioned before, the Fed can play a role in the loanable funds market. It's not all that common, but one of the questions you'll have on an assignment that I'll give you tomorrow for the weekend has to do with what kind of role does the Fed play. Really, when we talk about the Fed and buying and selling bonds, that has an impact on that can have an impact on the loanable funds market. Because basically, if the Fed buys bonds, banks have more money because the Fed purchases the bonds from commercial banks. Okay, the Fed gives them excess reserves, basically. You know, if they buy $5 million worth of bonds, now the bank has $5 million that are the reserve requirement will just say $5 million that it can lend out. So the Fed will say buying bonds up here would increase the supply of loanable funds. Okay, so the Fed buying bonds would increase the supply of loanable funds. Similarly, if the Fed sold bonds, that would decrease loanable funds, because in that case, if the Fed sold bonds, okay, what would end up happening is the commercial banks are taking their excess reserves and giving them to the Fed in exchange for bonds they'll earn interest on. So supply of loanable funds goes down, interest rates go up. And so that's kind of the chain reaction. Like I said, you'll have some more practice with it tomorrow. I'm going to add another graph to this called the Phillips curve. But for now, just think demand for loanable funds. Are people borrowing more? Consumers, businesses, government? Or are they borrowing less? If they're borrowing more, demand for loanable funds goes up, interest rates go up. If they're borrowing less, demand for loanable funds goes down, interest rates go down. A supply of loanable funds, think savers, foreigners, and the Fed. If people are putting more money in banks for any reason, okay, higher interest rates, or the government makes it a better tax deal, or our country is viewed as a good investment, all of these mean people are putting more money in our banks, supply of loanable funds goes up. If people are pulling money out of banks, okay, well, banks have less money to lend, supply of loanable funds goes down, interest rates go down. Okay, so there isn't any homework to go along with this. Keep working on your comparative advantage packets if you haven't finished those already. And we'll see you tomorrow with more graph action, in this case, the Phillips curve.